In a quiet town where life moves at an easy pace, the most unexpected moments can spark the biggest changes. It all begins with a simple trip to the grocery store, a young man, David Harris, calmly going about his day, and an elderly woman, Eleanor Hughes, whose sharp words ignite a tension that brings the store to a silent halt. "You people don't belong here." Her words cut deep, but David's response is not what anyone expects. What happens next sets off a ripple, a series of encounters and choices that challenge assumptions, mend old wounds, and remind everyone of the quiet power of kindness and grace. Through moments of anger, reflection, and unexpected connection, David and Eleanor find themselves on a path neither of them could have predicted, one where listening leads to understanding, and understanding leads to change. But change is never easy. How do you rebuild a bridge you did not know was broken? How do you plant the seeds of hope in soil that has long been hardened? The grocery store buzzed with quiet energy that afternoon. The hum of carts rolling across polished floors mixed with faint announcements over the speaker system. People moved with purpose, filling their baskets with fruits, canned goods, and bread, their minds occupied with dinner plans or weekly budgets. For many, it was just another ordinary day. For David Harris, grocery shopping had become a comforting routine. He appreciated the quiet predictability of it. He liked to move down the aisles slowly, comparing prices and weighing produce carefully. Today, he walked in with his canvas bag tucked under one arm, his phone buzzing softly in his pocket. He had spent the morning working, repairing old lawnmowers in the small garage where he was employed part-time. By early afternoon, he looked forward to this break. David was in his mid-20s, tall and lean, with calm brown eyes that often looked like they held more words than he spoke. His casual blue hoodie was clean but worn, and his jeans, though faded, were neatly pressed. He lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment across town, where the floors creaked and the water ran lukewarm on good days. Despite that, it was his place a haven where he could rest after long days of work. As David picked up a plastic basket near the store entrance, he thought of his mother, who often said, "Be careful out there, David. The world can be unfair, but it is what you make of it." Those words had become a part of him. He carried them quietly, as though stitched into his skin. He worked his way to the produce section, where rows of apples and oranges were stacked neatly. A few shoppers lingered nearby, selecting fruit with the same deliberation he often used. A young mother handed her toddler a bright red apple while murmuring to him softly. Across the aisle, an elderly woman, her frame small but sturdy, adjusted her glasses and reached for a bag of apples. David paid her no mind as he set his basket down and reached for a nearby bag of oranges. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, a text message. He held the bag of oranges with one hand while glancing briefly at the screen. It was a reminder for rent. The amount stared back at him, a number that always felt heavy no matter how hard he worked. "Excuse me," the elderly woman's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and sudden. David looked up. Her expression had changed. She gripped her bag of apples tightly in her small, veined hands. Her silver hair was pinned perfectly, her cardigan faded but neat. At first glance, she seemed like someone's grandmother, harmless and gentle. But there was nothing gentle about the way her pale blue eyes narrowed at him. "You people don't belong here," she said, her voice louder now. For a moment, David's mind went blank. He froze, fingers still holding the plastic bag of oranges. The words hit him like cold air, leaving him stunned. "I am sorry," he said finally, though his voice came out quieter than he intended. She took a small step forward, her gaze hard. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The words sliced through the hum of the store like a jagged knife. Time slowed. The world around him seemed to shrink as the air thickened. Shoppers nearby turned to look some frozen mid-motion, others averting their eyes. A couple near the bread aisle whispered to each other, though they did not intervene. David stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. His fingers hovered uselessly over his phone. For a brief second, the anger rose in his throat like heat, threatening to spill out. He could feel it sharp and burning, a response that wanted to snap back. But instead of shouting, he closed his eyes and exhaled. His mother's words returned to him, threading through his thoughts. The world can be unfair, but it is what you make of it. When he looked at her again, his voice was calm, though the heaviness in his chest remained. "Ma'am," he began slowly, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question hung in the air. It was not accusatory. If anything, it sounded reflective, like he was offering her a chance to think about her words, but she seemed uninterested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice cutting like glass. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." David's jaw tightened, but he stayed composed. He could feel the eyes of others pressing on him, waiting to see how he would respond. A young cashier near the registers craned her neck to get a better view. The teenage employee stocking bananas nearby had stopped completely, frozen mid-motion. The elderly woman's gaze did not waver. She stood her ground as if daring him to react. David's mind raced. He could shout. He could walk away. He could let the bitterness in his chest consume him. But none of those options felt right. Instead, he set his basket carefully on the floor and straightened his posture. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet weight of a man who had chosen his words carefully. "You said, 'I don't belong here,'" he said softly. "But let me tell you about where I come from." The store was silent. Even the faint hum of the refrigerators seemed to pause. The elderly woman shifted slightly, her lips pressed tightly together. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," David continued, his words steady. "He was a sharecropper who worked land he did not own, breaking his back to provide for his children. His father was a slave, a man who was beaten, sold, and treated like property. But he survived. And for what? To help build this country you are standing in." The elderly woman said nothing. The man near the dairy section put his phone down, his attention now fixed entirely on David. "My grandfather," David went on, his voice gaining quiet strength, "fought in World War II. He risked his life for this country, the same country that treated him like a second-class citizen when he came home. But he stayed, because he believed in America's promise, even when America did not believe in him." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And my parents? They fought too. My mother is a teacher. She has spent her life helping kids of all colors, all backgrounds. My father is a mechanic, the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help you if your car broke down." David's voice softened. "So, you see, ma'am, I belong here. My family belongs here. They paid for it in sweat and blood. You do not get to decide otherwise." The elderly woman's face flushed. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the apples against her chest. She opened her mouth as though to say something, but the words caught in her throat. From somewhere in the back of the store, a man's voice broke the silence. "He is right." The crowd seemed to exhale collectively. An older woman near the frozen food section nodded and said softly, "My father fought in that same war." The young cashier who had been watching called out from her station, her voice steady but emotional. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." The elderly woman's gaze flickered around the room, as if searching for an ally. None came. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced with something that looked almost like shame. David watched her for a moment longer, then bent down to pick up his basket. When he turned back to the crowd, his tone was quieter now. "Ignorance does not get better in silence," he said to no one in particular. "It is up to all of us to do better." The murmurs began to grow as people shifted back into motion. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered. The elderly woman turned her cart toward the exit, her shoulders hunched as she walked away. David let out a slow breath and resumed his shopping. As he placed the oranges in his basket, a woman with kind eyes approached him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. David nodded faintly, offering her a small smile. He did not feel like he had won or lost anything. But as he walked toward the checkout line, he carried something different with him, a quiet sense that he had done what needed to be done. Outside, the sky was starting to dim. David tucked his bag of groceries under one arm and headed to his car. He glanced briefly at the parking lot and noticed the elderly woman sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he considered approaching her, but he decided against it. Some lessons, he thought, take time to settle. As he drove home, the echoes of the day stayed with him. He did not know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain. Kindness, even in the face of ignorance, was the only way forward. The drive home was quiet. The soft hum of David's car engine was the only sound as he navigated the familiar streets of the small Ohio town. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across rows of houses, their windows glowing with warmth as families settled into their evening routines. David kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was still tangled in the encounter at the grocery store. He replayed the woman's words over and over, like a scratch on a record that refused to stop. "You people don't belong here." The phrase carried a weight that pressed against his chest. Even though he had responded with calm and dignity, the sting remained. He pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex, the cracked pavement dotted with a few cars that looked as worn as his. His building was an aging two-story structure, faded paint peeling from its wooden panels. It was not much, but it was home a small, one-bedroom apartment on the second floor with a single window overlooking a patchy lawn. David grabbed his bag of groceries from the passenger seat, his fingers lingering on the handle for a moment as he took another deep breath. The silence in the car was suffocating, yet stepping back into the world outside felt heavier still. The apartment was quiet when he stepped inside. He flicked on the overhead light, revealing a simple living room with a small couch, a coffee table cluttered with unopened mail, and a shelf holding a few books and family photos. A framed picture of his parents sat prominently in the center. His father, broad-shouldered and strong, stood with his arms folded, his face serious but kind. His mother smiled beside him, her eyes filled with warmth. David stared at the photo for a moment, hearing echoes of their voices in his head. He set the groceries on the counter, unpacking them with slow, deliberate movements. Oranges, bread, a carton of milk. It was the same as every other week, yet everything felt different. The weight of the day lingered in the air. Collapsing onto the couch, David let his head fall back against the worn cushion. The ceiling fan above him whirred softly, the sound almost hypnotic as he allowed himself to sink into his thoughts. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to moments when words like the ones spoken today were more common than not. He remembered walking home from school as a boy, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders, when a group of kids shouted at him from across the street, "Go back to where you came from." At the time, David did not understand what they meant. He had gone home crying that day, his mother kneeling in front of him, wiping his tears with her gentle hands. "Do not let them make you feel small, David," she had told him, her voice firm but loving. "Their words do not define you. You hear me? You are strong, and you belong in this world just as much as anyone else." That day had stayed with him, though the scars it left were invisible. Over the years, David had learned to push past the hurt, to keep his head down and keep moving. But moments like the one at the grocery store cracked open the parts of him that he had tried so hard to protect. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. David frowned slightly, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was just past 7. He stood up, his footsteps soft against the worn carpet as he moved to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see a familiar face. "Hi, David." It was Linda Brooks, the woman who had quietly thanked him at the grocery store. She stood on the doorstep, her expression soft but purposeful. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was tucked behind her ears, and she held a small notebook in one hand. Hi, David said, blinking in surprise. How did you know where I live? Linda smiled faintly. This town is small enough that if you ask around, you can find just about anyone. She paused, hesitating, as if unsure what to say next. I hope you do not mind me stopping by. David shook his head, stepping aside to let her in. No, it's fine. Come on in. The apartment felt even smaller with someone else inside it. Linda looked around briefly, taking in the simplicity of David's living space. It's cozy, she said warmly, though David could not help but feel self-conscious about the peeling paint on the walls and the uneven coffee table. Thanks, he said, offering a faint smile. Can I get you something to drink? I don't have much, just water or milk? Linda laughed softly. Water is fine, thank you. David poured a glass and handed it to her, gesturing for her to sit on the couch while he settled into the chair across from her. So, what brings you here? He asked, his tone curious but cautious. Linda took a sip of water, then set the glass on the coffee table. I wanted to talk to you about what happened today, she began. I was there, at the grocery store. I heard everything. And I wanted to tell you that I was impressed by how you handled it. David's brow furrowed slightly. I don't know about that, he said quietly. I didn't want to let it slide, you know? Linda nodded. I understand. A lot of people would have walked away or shouted back, but you stood there and spoke the truth, and you did it with so much dignity. That is not easy, David. David shrugged, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair. It didn't feel like I had much of a choice. Her words they were wrong. They were, Linda agreed firmly. But the way you spoke, it left an impression. On me, and I think on others too. That is why I came here. She paused, looking him in the eyes. Have you ever spoken in front of a group? David frowned, confused by the question. No, not really. Why? Linda shifted slightly, leaning forward. I help organize a group at the community center. It is a mix of people from all walks of life, young, old, black, white, Latino. We meet every other week to talk about issues in the community, to share stories, and to try to build understanding. After what happened today, I think you have something to share, David. Your words could really make a difference. David stared at her, caught off guard. I don't know, he said after a moment. I am not really the kind of person who likes to stand in front of a crowd. I get that, Linda said gently, but you do not have to be someone else to make an impact. You just have to be you. David glanced at the photo of his parents on the shelf, their faces calm and unwavering. His mother's words echoed faintly in his mind. You are strong, and you belong in this world. Just think about it, Linda added softly. No pressure, but I really think people need to hear from you. David nodded slowly. I will think about it. Linda smiled, standing up and grabbing her notebook from the table. That's all I can ask. Thank you for letting me stop by, David. He walked her to the door, watching as she stepped out into the cool evening air. Before she left, she turned back to him. The next meeting is this Friday at 7. If you decide to come, you are more than welcome. David watched her walk toward her car, the faint glow of the street lamp casting long shadows across the parking lot. When she was gone, he closed the door and leaned against it, his thoughts swirling. The idea of speaking to a group made his stomach twist. He had spent so much of his life avoiding attention, keeping to himself. He had seen the way people looked at him sometimes, the assumptions they made, the quiet judgments that came with being who he was. Standing in front of strangers and sharing his story felt impossible. And yet, Linda's words lingered. Your words could really make a difference. David sank onto the couch again, staring at the photo of his parents. He thought of his grandfather, who had fought for a country that refused to fight for him. He thought of his parents, who had worked tirelessly to give him a better life. And he thought of the grocery store today, the way the air had gone heavy with silence until he chose to speak. Maybe Linda is right, he thought. Maybe it is time to stop staying silent. As the apartment grew darker with the setting sun, David sat quietly, letting the thought settle. Friday arrived faster than David expected. The days in between felt like a haze his routines carried on as usual. But Linda's invitation lingered at the back of his mind, like a faint hum he could not ignore. The idea of standing in front of a room full of strangers made him uneasy. It was not just the fear of public speaking, it was something deeper. A fear of being vulnerable, a fear of saying too much or not saying enough. That morning, David woke early, sunlight spilling through the thin curtains in his apartment. He sat at the small kitchen table, staring down at his cup of coffee. He did not drink it. He just stared at the steam curling upward, lost in thought. The quiet was both comforting and suffocating. Why am I even considering this? He thought. He had lived his whole life keeping his head down, doing what was expected, and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Speaking up at the grocery store had been instinctive, like a pressure valve releasing. But this standing in front of a crowd and sharing his story felt different. David glanced at the photo of his parents on the shelf across the room. His father's stoic expression and his mother's soft smile, watching him as always. "You're stronger than you think, David." That was something his father used to say. Usually when David faced challenges he did not feel ready for. As the hours slipped by, he tried to distract himself with work. He spent most of the day in the small garage where he worked part-time, fixing up old lawnmowers and tools brought in by the local townspeople. It was honest work, and he liked the quiet focus it demanded. The smell of grease and metal helped settle his nerves, but the thought of the meeting crept in again and again. By late afternoon, David found himself back in his apartment, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. He adjusted the hood of his clean blue sweatshirt, staring at his reflection. "You don't have to go," he told himself quietly. "No one's forcing you." And yet, something inside him tugged, a quiet voice that pushed against his fear. "Maybe this is what you're meant to do," it whispered. The community center was an old brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by a small patch of grass where children's laughter often echoed during the day. That evening, though, the lot was quiet. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, washing the sky in hues of orange and violet, as David pulled into the parking lot. He sat in his car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The fluorescent light above the entrance flickered faintly, casting soft shadows across the pavement. A few people trickled in, their chatter muffled by the windows. David's heart thudded in his chest. He could turn around. No one would know. Then he thought of Linda's voice from earlier in the week. "People need to hear from you." He thought of the cashier at the grocery store who had thanked him, the man near the dairy aisle who had spoken up. He thought of his grandfather and his parents, everything they had endured, and everything they had given him. With a deep breath, he opened the car door. The evening air was cool against his face as he walked toward the entrance, his footsteps steady but hesitant. Inside, the community center was simple but welcoming. Rows of folding chairs were arranged neatly in a circle in the main hall. The room was brightly lit, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the space. David paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Linda was there, her face lighting up when she spotted him. She waved him over, her smile warm and encouraging. "You came," she said as he approached. "Yeah," David replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not sure why, but here I am." Linda laughed softly. "That's enough." She gestured toward an empty chair near the edge of the circle. "Go ahead and grab a seat. We'll get started soon." David nodded and sat down, feeling the eyes of a few people shift briefly toward him. He recognized some of them from the grocery store faces that had watched him that day in silent curiosity. There was an older man with white hair and a faded veteran's cap, a young teacher who looked no older than 30, and a teenage boy wearing headphones draped around his neck. The room was a mix of ages and backgrounds, yet everyone shared the same air of quiet anticipation. Linda stepped into the center of the circle and clapped her hands lightly to gather attention. The conversations fell silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "For those of you who are new, welcome. And for those who have been coming, welcome back." She glanced at David briefly, offering a small nod of encouragement before continuing. "We started this group because we wanted to create a space where people could share their experiences, where we could learn from one another and build understanding. This is a space for stories, for listening, for growth." The room was still as Linda's words sank in. "Tonight," she said softly, "I invited someone who I think has something important to share." David's chest tightened as Linda's eyes met his. "David, would you like to say a few words?" Every muscle in David's body tensed. His hands gripped his knees as all the faces in the room turned toward him. He felt like the walls were closing in, the silence suddenly deafening. For a brief moment, he considered shaking his head, staying in his seat, and letting someone else speak. But then he thought of that day in the grocery store, the moment when he had spoken not for attention, but because he had no choice. He thought of how quiet the room had gone, how his words had filled that silence with something meaningful. With a deep breath, David stood. His legs felt shaky, but he steadied himself, shoving his hands into the pockets of his hoodie as he looked around the room. Hi," he started, his voice unsure. "My name is David." A few people nodded, their faces soft with encouragement. I don't really do this kind of thing," he admitted, a faint chuckle escaping his lips. "I'm not used to speaking in front of people." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "A few days ago, I was at the grocery store, and—" He hesitated, his mind flashing to the elderly woman's sharp words, the silence that had followed. "Something happened that I'm sure some of you saw. A woman said something hurtful to me, something that I've heard before in my life. But this time, I decided to say something back." The room was quiet, all eyes fixed on him. David felt the weight of his own words as he continued. "I didn't speak out because I wanted to embarrass her or make a scene. I spoke out because I couldn't let it sit there, like it was okay. It wasn't okay." He shifted slightly, his voice growing steadier. "My family, my great-great-grandfather, my parents, they worked hard to build lives here. They sacrificed so much, even when the world didn't make it easy for them. And I know I'm not the only one here who feels that way." David looked around the room, meeting the eyes of strangers who now seemed a little less like strangers. "I don't know what happens next, but I do know one thing. Silence doesn't change anything. Ignorance doesn't get better if we don't face it." He stopped, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. "That's all I wanted to say." The room was still for a moment, then Linda began to clap. The sound was soft at first, but soon others joined in. The applause was not thunderous, but it was sincere. David sat back down, his heart still racing but his shoulders lighter somehow. As the meeting continued, others began to speak, sharing stories of their own experiences, their fears, and their hopes. The young teacher talked about her students and their struggles. The older veteran shared stories of the war and the lessons he learned about unity. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he was part of something bigger. As he listened, he realized how many others carried burdens like his, how many wanted to be heard, but never knew how to start. When the meeting ended, people lingered to talk. A teenage boy approached David, his expression shy but determined. "What you said, it meant a lot. the boy said quietly. "Thank you." David nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Any time," he replied. As David stepped out into the cool night air, he felt different, stronger, more grounded. The ripple that had started in the grocery store had begun to spread, and for the first time, David wondered just how far it could go. David could not sleep that night. The echoes of the community center meeting replayed in his mind, faces, voices, words that lingered long after the doors had closed. It was not just his own story that stayed with him. It was the stories of others. The young teacher, Samantha, who had spoken about her immigrant students struggling to find acceptance. The older veteran, George, who told of fighting alongside people of all colors during the war, and realizing that unity was not just a word, it was survival. And the teenage boy, quiet and shy, who had whispered, "Thank you," as if the words held more weight than he could carry. Lying in bed, David stared at the cracks on the ceiling of his small apartment. A soft breeze pushed through the window, ruffling the worn curtains. He had not expected to feel anything beyond relief when the meeting ended, but instead, there was a quiet stirring inside him, something like purpose. "Maybe you planted a seed tonight," he thought, repeating his father's old words. And yet, his mind kept drifting back to one person who was not there. Eleanor Hughes. The elderly woman's sharp words from the grocery store still hung in the corners of his memory like cobwebs. She had been so certain of her anger, so deeply rooted in her beliefs, that David had wondered what her story was. What makes someone carry that kind of bitterness for so long, he thought. He did not know. But for some reason, it mattered to him. The next morning, the sky was gray and overcast, the kind of day that made everything feel heavier. David woke up early, the echoes of the previous evening still fresh in his mind. He spent the morning keeping busy sweeping the apartment floor, scrubbing dishes that did not really need scrubbing, and rearranging books he had already organized a dozen times. But distraction only worked for so long. By noon, David found himself sitting at his kitchen table again, the silence pressing down on him. His thoughts circled back to Eleanor. Something inside him told him their story was not finished, even though a part of him wanted to let it go. Some lessons take time to settle. He had told himself that in the parking lot, after the grocery store incident. But maybe some lessons needed a little push. Before he could talk himself out of it, David stood up and grabbed his jacket. He did not know exactly what he planned to do, but he knew where he was going. Eleanor Hughes lived in a modest white house on the edge of town. It was small, like most of the homes in that neighborhood, with a neatly trimmed lawn and faded shutters that had once been a bright blue. A small wooden rocking chair sat empty on the porch, the cushion worn thin from years of use. David pulled his car to the curb and sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He could turn around. He could drive away and pretend he never came. But something in him would not let him leave. After a deep breath, David stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the cracked pathway to the door. He hesitated before knocking, his fist hovering mid-air. What was he even going to say? The door opened before he could decide. Eleanor stood there, her silver hair pinned neatly as always, her cardigan buttoned up to the collar. She blinked at David, her expression unreadable. "Hello, ma'am," David said softly, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jeans. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I thought maybe we could talk." Eleanor's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice was calm when she spoke. "I don't know what we need to talk about." David nodded faintly. "I just thought it might help to understand each other a little better." For a moment, Eleanor stared at him, her grip tightening slightly on the edge of the door. David could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the way she seemed to weigh his presence like a scale. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. "Come in, then," she said curtly. David stepped inside, glancing around the small, tidy room. The walls were decorated with faded family portraits, black and white photos of children and weddings, faces frozen in time. A small clock ticked loudly on the mantel above the fireplace, filling the room with its steady rhythm. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing toward an armchair across from the couch. She eased herself into the couch with a faint huff, folding her hands primly in her lap. David sat down slowly, feeling the tension in the room settle like dust. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor stared at him with an unreadable expression, as if she were waiting for him to say something first. "I'm not here to argue," David began finally, his voice steady but quiet. I don't think people say things like what you said without a reason. And I guess I wanted to understand." Eleanor's lips pursed tightly, and for a moment, David thought she might snap at him, dismiss him outright. But then she spoke, her voice softer than he expected. "You don't know me, young man. You don't know what I've lived through." David nodded. "You're right. I don't. But I'd like to." Eleanor's eyes narrowed again, though her voice wavered slightly. "You people. I mean," she trailed off, the words catching in her throat. "Things were different when I grew up. People knew their place. It wasn't like it is now." David tilted his head slightly, his gaze calm. "Different doesn't mean better." Eleanor flinched slightly, but she said nothing. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together like they were trying to tie knots. "When I was a girl, my father worked every day at the steel mill. He said he worked hard for his family, for his country, and that it was his land to pass down. People who weren't like us, well, he didn't trust them. He said they didn't belong." She stopped, her voice faltering, as if speaking those words out loud chipped away at something inside her. David sat still, giving her space to continue. "Maybe that's how I got to thinking like I do," she said softly. "It's not an excuse. It's just what I know." David's brow furrowed slightly, his voice gentle. "But you're here now, in this time. Things change, ma'am. And sometimes we have to change too." Eleanor looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something that looked like sadness. "And what would you know about changing?" David met her gaze firmly. "I know plenty." He paused, taking a slow breath. "My great-great-grandfather was born into slavery. My grandfather fought in a war for a country that didn't treat him like an equal. My parents worked every day to build a life for me, even when people like you said they didn't belong. And still, they chose kindness. They chose to believe in something better, even when the world didn't." Eleanor's expression softened. Her fingers stopped twisting. "And you?" David shrugged faintly. "I'm just trying to do the same." The silence between them grew heavier. Eleanor glanced at the portraits on the walls, her gaze lingering on an old photograph of a man in a soldier's uniform, her late husband, David guessed. Her voice, when it came, was faint. "My husband fought in the war, too." David nodded. "Then he fought alongside men like my grandfather, men who believed in the same freedom he did." Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight of her own words had finally caught up with her. "I suppose I never thought of it that way." David offered her a small, faint smile. "Maybe it's time to start." Eleanor did not respond, but something in her expression shifted like a window cracking open, letting in a sliver of light. As David stood to leave, Eleanor looked up at him. "You came all this way just to talk to me?" David nodded. "Sometimes a conversation's all it takes." She looked down again, nodding faintly. "Maybe you're right." David paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "There's a meeting at the community center next week, people sharing stories, building understanding. You'd be welcome to come, if you wanted." Eleanor did not reply, but the faraway look in her eyes told David she was thinking about it. As he stepped outside and closed the door behind him, David felt lighter somehow. The encounter had not been perfect. Eleanor had not changed overnight. But something had shifted. And that, he thought, was enough for now. As he drove home, the gray sky began to part, and faint streaks of sunlight broke through the clouds. David watched the light spread across the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. The days that followed were quiet, but filled with reflection. David's conversation with Eleanor lingered in his mind like an unresolved melody. She had not exactly apologized, but something in her demeanor, the slight crack in her voice, the softening of her gaze told David that seeds had been planted. Whether they would take root was not up to him. He had done what he could. That Friday evening, David sat in his apartment, staring at the soft glow of the lamp that lit up his small living room. The community center meeting was happening again tonight, but he was not sure if he would go. It had been a long week, and something about the quiet of his apartment, despite how lonely it often felt, seemed comforting. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. "Hope to see you at the meeting tonight. By the way, you might want to check your mail. A little surprise came your way." David frowned, confused, but stood up and walked outside to the small bank of mailboxes by the building's entrance. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of someone's dinner being cooked in a nearby apartment. He unlocked his box and found the usual a few bills, a flyer for a local car dealership, but nestled among them was something unexpected. A small white envelope, handwritten with his name. He turned it over and opened it carefully. Inside was a simple note. "David, thank you for coming to talk. I am still thinking about what you said. I would like to try to understand better. Come by for dinner Sunday evening if you can. I will make something decent. Eleanor Hughes." David read the note twice, his brow furrowed. He could not help but let out a small breath of surprise. It was not an apology, but it was an invitation, something he never would have expected from her. He stood there for a moment, staring at the note in his hands. A part of him hesitated. Could he trust her intentions? Was this some kind of test? Another confrontation waiting to happen? But then he thought about her face when she spoke of her late husband, of her father's words that had shaped her beliefs. He thought about how hard it must be for someone to question their worldview after holding it for so long. Eleanor Hughes might not have been ready for change yet, but she was willing to open the door just a crack. And that, he decided, was enough reason to show up. Sunday evening came, and David found himself driving back to Eleanor's small white house. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and gold as the sun dipped low on the horizon. It was the kind of sunset that made everything look softer, more forgiving. David parked along the curb and grabbed a small brown paper bag from the passenger seat. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread he had picked up from the bakery down the street. His mother had always told him, "Never show up empty-handed." As he walked up the cracked path, the wooden porch creaked beneath his shoes. He hesitated for only a moment before knocking on the door. Eleanor answered almost immediately. She looked different than before, not softer, exactly, but less guarded. She wore a pale blue sweater that matched the color of her eyes, and her silver hair was pinned back neatly as always. "You came," she said, her voice carrying a faint note of surprise. David nodded, holding out the bag. "I brought this bread. I hope that's all right." Eleanor took the bag, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "You did not have to bring anything, but thank you. Come on in." The house smelled warm, like roasted chicken and herbs. It was a comforting smell that reminded David of Sunday dinners at his parents' house growing up. Eleanor gestured toward the small dining table, already set with 2 plates and a simple centerpiece ajar with fresh daisies. "I made chicken and potatoes," she said, as she placed the bread in the center of the table. "I am not much of a cook these days, but I figured you'd need something better than takeout." David smiled faintly. "It smells great, ma'am." "Thank you." "None of that ma'am business," Eleanor said, waving him toward a chair. "Just Eleanor." David nodded and sat down, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Eleanor brought the dishes over, and for a while, the room was quiet except for the clinking of plates and silverware. David stole a glance at the family photos on the wall, the same ones he had seen before. The man in the military uniform caught his eye again. "That's your husband?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder at the photo, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Harold. He passed away 20 years ago." "He fought in the war?" "He did," she replied, sitting back in her chair. "He was a good man, tough but fair. He always said the world was changing too fast for him to keep up." David nodded, choosing his words carefully. "You said the other day that people knew their place back then. Do you think Harold felt that way too?" Eleanor stiffened slightly, but her gaze did not waver. "He had his ways, same as I did. But the war, it changed him. When he came back, he never spoke badly about the men he fought besides, no matter what they looked like." She paused, her voice softening. "Sometimes I wonder what he would think of me now." David watched her carefully. "Maybe he would want you to see things the way he did." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something David could not quite place. "Maybe," she admitted. The conversation lulled again, but the silence was not uncomfortable. David focused on his plate, surprised at how good the food was. "This is really nice," he said after a moment, smiling faintly. "Thank you for inviting me." Eleanor seemed caught off guard by the compliment, her face flushing slightly. "It is just dinner," she muttered. "Nothing special." "It's more than that," David replied gently. "Most people would not do what you're doing." Eleanor looked up at him, her blue eyes sharp yet thoughtful. "And what exactly am I doing?" David shrugged. "Trying to understand, that takes courage." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment before looking down at her plate. "I don't know if it is courage or just curiosity." She paused, her voice quieter now. "I still don't know how to feel about all this, about everything you said the other day." "That's okay," David said softly. "Change does not happen overnight, but the fact that you are trying, that matters." Eleanor looked at him again, something shifting in her expression. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then she closed it again, shaking her head with a faint chuckle. "You are a stubborn young man, you know that?" David smiled. "So, I have been told." Eleanor pushed her chair back and stood up, walking to the kitchen. When she returned, she held a small photo frame in her hands. She set it carefully on the table, in front of David. David leaned forward to look. It was an old photograph, faded, but still clear enough to make out the faces. A group of soldiers stood together, muddy and tired, but smiling faintly at the camera. One of them was Harold. Beside him was a black man, his arms slung over Harold's shoulder, like they had been brothers their whole lives. "That was his friend Joseph," Eleanor said quietly. "Harold used to talk about him sometimes, said he saved his life more than once." David looked up at her, the weight of the photo sinking in. "They fought for each other," he said softly. Eleanor nodded. "They did." For a moment, the room felt heavy with memory. Eleanor sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. "I do not know if I will ever understand everything, David. But I am trying." David smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can ask for." As the evening wore on, the tension between them softened. They spoke of simpler things, the weather, the town, memories of their families. When David finally stood to leave, Eleanor walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice genuine. "Thank you for inviting me," David replied. As he stepped outside, the air felt lighter somehow, as though something had shifted not just in Eleanor, but in him as well. He glanced back at the house before driving away, a faint smile pulling at his lips. Sometimes, he thought, change begins with something as simple as a shared table. The days following dinner with Eleanor were different. It was not a drastic shift, no dramatic transformation or overnight resolution, but there was a new sense of possibility that lingered in David's mind. Change, as his father always said, did not happen all at once. It was like water shaping stone, slow, persistent, and patient. David had not heard from Eleanor since that night, but he thought about her often. Her words, her hesitation, and that photograph of Harold and Joseph had stayed with him. Harold trusted Joseph with his life, David thought more than once. And here we are, still trying to understand each other decades later. The following Friday, David found himself back at the community center. This time, he walked in with more confidence, a faint smile tugging at his lips when he saw familiar faces. Linda greeted him at the door, her notebook in hand and a warmth in her voice. "You came back," she said with a smile. "Yeah," David replied, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. "Figured I'd see how things are going." "Things are going better than I expected," Linda said. "People are starting to open up more. It takes time, but little by little, we're getting there." David nodded, feeling those words settle in him. Little by little. It was becoming something of a mantra. As he stepped into the main room, he noticed more people this time. A few new faces sat among the regulars, a young black couple sitting close together, a Latino man in a work uniform, and an older woman with kind eyes who smiled faintly when David passed. He found his usual chair near the back of the circle and settled in quietly. The meeting began like it always did, with Linda welcoming everyone and reminding them of the group's purpose: to share, to listen, and to grow. David liked that about her. She never spoke with judgment or authority. She made people feel like they belonged just by being there. Linda glanced up, and her eyes landed on David. "Before we get started tonight," she said, her voice clear, "I wanted to share something that happened this week." The room quieted, everyone leaning in just slightly. "I got a phone call a couple of days ago from someone who asked about this group," Linda continued. "Someone who wanted to learn more and said they were trying to see things differently." David's brow furrowed, curiosity prickling at him. Linda's gaze shifted toward the doorway, where someone stood just beyond the edge of the room. "Please, come on in," she said gently. David turned his head, and his chest tightened. There, standing in the doorway, with her small frame straight and her cardigan buttoned up to her collar, was Eleanor Hughes. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Eleanor's face was flushed, and she looked like she was considering turning right back around. Her hand clutched the strap of her purse tightly, as though it anchored her to the floor. Linda gave her an encouraging nod. "You're welcome here, Eleanor." Eleanor took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling with the effort, before she finally stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked faintly under her shoes as she made her way to an empty chair. She sat stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. David watched her, his surprise giving way to something else, something like quiet respect. She had come. He did not know why, but she had come. Linda cleared her throat gently, breaking the silence. "Thank you for joining us tonight, Eleanor." Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Linda, then the rest of the group. "I don't know why I'm here," she said abruptly, her voice sharp but trembling slightly. I don't know if I belong here." David could see the tension in her jaw, the way she gripped her hands together. She was uncomfortable, out of place, and afraid to admit it. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the grocery store, defiant, certain, and angry. Now, that same woman looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of her own uncertainty was pressing on her shoulders. "You're here," Linda said gently, "and that's what matters." Eleanor did not respond. Instead, she stared down at her hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. The meeting continued as it always did. People shared stories, some of pain, others of hope. Samantha, the young teacher, spoke about how she had started a kindness initiative in her classroom. The kids wrote notes to each other, she said, smiling faintly. Little things like, "You're a good friend," or "I like your smile." You'd be amazed how far something that small can go. Others spoke too. George, the older veteran, shared a memory about his time overseas. "It didn't matter what color a man was when bullets were flying," he said softly. "We looked out for each other because that's what mattered." David listened quietly, glancing at Eleanor every now and then. She stayed silent through it all, her gaze fixed on the floor. He wondered what she was thinking if the stories around her were breaking through the walls she had built for so long. As the meeting neared its end, Linda looked at Eleanor again. "Eleanor, would you like to say anything before we wrap up?" Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Me?" Linda nodded, her expression kind but unwavering. "If you want to, there's no pressure." Eleanor hesitated, shifting in her chair. The room held its breath, the silence almost tangible. Finally, she spoke. I don't know what to say," Eleanor began, her voice softer now. "I came here tonight because someone—" Her gaze flickered toward David briefly before darting away again. "Because someone told me it's never too late to try and understand. I don't know if I'll ever get it right, but—" She paused, her hands trembling faintly. "I wanted to hear what you all had to say. I wanted to listen." The room stayed quiet for a moment, as though no one wanted to interrupt what had just been said. Then, softly, Linda spoke. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said. "Listening is the first step." Eleanor nodded quickly, looking down again, as if embarrassed by her own words. But David saw something different, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. After the meeting ended, people began to gather their things and head for the door. David lingered near the back of the room, watching as Eleanor stood and made her way toward the exit. Her steps were slow, uncertain, as if she were still deciding whether coming here had been the right choice. Before she reached the door, David stepped forward. "Eleanor." She stopped and turned, her pale blue eyes meeting his. David offered her a small, genuine smile. "It was good to see you here tonight." Eleanor blinked, clearly surprised. For a moment, it looked like she might say something sharp or defensive, but instead, she sighed and nodded. "It wasn't easy." "I know," David said softly, "but you did it anyway." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment before nodding again. "Thank you, David." David watched her leave, her small figure disappearing into the cool night air. He did not know if she would come back. Maybe she would. Maybe she would not. But it did not matter. She had taken the first step, and sometimes that was enough. As he walked toward his car, David felt a sense of quiet hope settle over him. The bridge between himself and Eleanor was not complete, but the first stones had been laid. "Change takes time," his father used to say, "but it always starts with one person willing to try." David looked up at the darkening sky, where stars were beginning to blink into view. He thought about the stories he had heard tonight, the small acts of kindness that had built understanding in ways words alone never could. Maybe, he thought, change really did begin with listening. The next week began like any other, with the soft hum of routines guiding David through his days. Morning coffee, hours at the garage repairing old machines, and evenings spent quietly in his apartment. Yet there was something different now, something that sat quietly in the back of his mind. Eleanor. She had shown up to the community meeting, and though her words had been few, her presence had said enough. It meant she was listening. It meant she was trying. David had not seen her or heard from her since that night, but he found himself thinking of her often, how someone so seemingly unmovable had chosen to take even the smallest step forward. By Wednesday afternoon, David's day had been unremarkable. He spent most of it fixing a rusted-out mower someone had left in the back of the garage. His hands were stained with grease, and his shirt clung to his back as he leaned over the stubborn machine, coaxing it back to life. He heard the garage door creak open behind him and glanced over his shoulder. Standing there was Samantha Kelly, the young teacher from the community meetings. She was dressed in jeans and a sweater, her shoulder-length brown hair tied back loosely. She smiled faintly as she stepped forward. "Hey, David." David wiped his hands on a rag and stood, his brow furrowing slightly. "Samantha, right?" "Yeah," she said, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Sorry to interrupt your work. I got your name from Linda. She said you might be willing to help me out with something." David raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" Samantha hesitated, clearly unsure of how to ask. "I teach ninth grade English at the high school," she began. "My kids have been working on a project about community and storytelling, about sharing who we are and what we can learn from each other. Some of them have trouble seeing the bigger picture, you know? They think their struggles are theirs alone, and no one else understands." David nodded, understanding what she meant. "So," Samantha continued, "I was hoping you might come in and talk to them. Just share your story, like you did at the community center. Show them that everyone has something they are working through, and that kindness and listening can change things." David stiffened. "I do not know about that," he said, shaking his head. "I am not a teacher. I would not even know where to start." Samantha smiled patiently. "You do not have to be a teacher. You just have to be you. That is enough." David sighed, running a hand over his face. The idea of standing in front of a room full of teenagers made his stomach twist. "Why me?" "Because your words matter," Samantha replied softly. "You do not even realize it, but they do. And sometimes kids just need to hear that someone else has been there, that someone understands." David looked down at the grease-stained rag in his hands, unsure what to say. Samantha seemed to sense his hesitation. "Just think about it, all right? Friday morning. If you can come, we would be glad to have you." With that, she turned and walked back toward the door. Before she left, she glanced over her shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest things to do are the ones that matter most. You taught us that, David." Friday morning came faster than David would have liked. He woke up early, staring at the ceiling as the soft light of dawn crept through his window. The idea of speaking to a group of teenagers still made him uneasy, but Samantha's words lingered. Sometimes kids just need to hear that someone else has been there. After a long shower and 2 cups of coffee, David stood in front of the mirror, pulling on a clean gray sweater. He smoothed his hands over it, his movements deliberate. He thought of his father, who always told him to look his best when he wanted people to take him seriously. "You are stronger than you think, David," his father's voice echoed in his mind. By 8:30, David found himself pulling into the parking lot of the local high school. The brick building loomed in front of him, flags fluttering gently in the cool morning breeze. Groups of students wandered toward the entrance, their chatter and laughter filling the air. David took a deep breath before stepping out of the car, gripping the strap of his bag tightly as he walked inside. Samantha was waiting for him just past the front office, her smile bright and reassuring. "You came?" she said warmly. "I told myself I would try," David replied, his voice gruff but steady. "Thank you," Samantha said softly. "The kids are going to get a lot out of this." She led him through the long hallways, where posters for sports teams and student events lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings and cafeteria food, a scent that made David feel like a kid again. He glanced into a few classrooms as they passed, seeing students hunched over desks or chatting in small groups. Finally, Samantha stopped outside her classroom door. "They are a good group, I promise, and I will be right there the whole time." David nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as she opened the door. The classroom quieted as they walked in. Rows of teenagers turned in their seats, their faces curious but cautious. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms folded. Others sat up straighter, their attention piqued by the new visitor. "This is David Harris," Samantha said, smiling at the room. "He has been kind enough to come and talk to us today. Listen closely. He has a lot to share." David stepped forward slowly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For a moment, he felt like a boy again, standing in front of the class to deliver a book report he had not prepared for. He cleared his throat, looking out at the faces in front of him. Hi," he started awkwardly. "I am David." A few kids exchanged glances, but no one said anything. Samantha smiled at him encouragingly from the back of the room. I am not really used to doing this," David admitted. "But I guess I wanted to talk to you all because I know how it feels to feel like no one understands, like the world is against you, and there is nothing you can do about it." The room grew quiet. Even the kids slouched in their seats seemed to lean in a little closer. David took a deep breath, his voice steadying. "When I was younger, I learned pretty fast that people can say things that hurt you, words you never forget. Sometimes it is because they do not know any better, and sometimes it is because no one has ever asked them to see things differently. But here is the thing. You don't have to let those words define you. You don't have to carry them like a weight." He paused, meeting their eyes. "The truth is, kindness takes strength. It is easy to get angry, to lash out, but choosing kindness that takes courage, it is the only way to make things better." A hand shot up from the front row. It was a girl with dark curls framing her face. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. David nodded, as though he expected the question. "A woman said something to me a couple weeks ago that I will never forget. It hurt. But instead of walking away or yelling back, I decided to tell her the truth. I told her about my family, my great-great-grandfather, my parents, and everything they worked for. I wanted her to know that I belong here just as much as she does." The room stayed silent as his words sank in. "Maybe she did not change right away," David added softly. "But I think she is trying. And that is the thing about kindness, it plants seeds. It may take a while, but one day those seeds grow." For the first time, David saw it, the understanding in their faces, the quiet recognition of something deeper. They were listening. Samantha stepped forward as David finished, her voice warm. "Thank you, David." The students clapped, hesitant at first, but it grew until the whole room joined in. David let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a faint smile tugging at his lips. As the class began to pack up, a boy from the back of the room approached David. He was tall and lanky, with a shy expression. "What you said, it made sense," he muttered. "Thanks for coming." David nodded, his voice soft. "Any time." As he left the school that morning, the sun had risen fully, casting light across the parking lot. David glanced back at the building and smiled faintly. Maybe Samantha was right. Sometimes kids just needed to hear that someone else had been there. And maybe, just maybe, he had planted a seed. The sun was beginning to set as David parked his car in front of his apartment that evening. The faint hum of life surrounded him, kids shouting and laughing as they rode their bikes, a couple chatting quietly on their balcony, and the sound of a distant lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood. It was familiar and grounding. But David's thoughts were still with the students he had spoken to earlier that day. He sat in the car for a moment, watching the sky shift from gold to deep orange, replaying the looks on their faces as they listened to him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his voice had carried farther than the walls of his own small life. He thought of the shy boy who had thanked him, the girl with the dark curls who had asked him what had happened. They had listened, and something about that had given him hope. But lingering in the back of his mind, like an old echo, was Eleanor Hughes. That night, as David sat at his small kitchen table, eating a simple dinner of rice and beans, he heard a knock at the door. It was late, too late for the usual drop-in from neighbors or delivery mistakes. He set his fork down, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he stood. When he opened the door, he blinked in surprise. Standing there, clutching a small paper bag and wearing her ever-present cardigan, was Eleanor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her expression was guarded, but not harsh, her pale blue eyes softer than he had ever seen them. "Eleanor?" David said finally, stepping back slightly. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor glanced down at the bag she held before meeting his gaze again. I brought you something." David hesitated, but then stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come on in." She stepped in slowly, her small frame looking almost out of place in his modest living room. David noticed the way she glanced around the mismatched furniture, the small bookshelf lined with family photos, the smell of something faintly burnt from a failed attempt at breakfast earlier that morning. "It's not much," David said, almost apologetically. "It's yours," Eleanor replied softly, surprising him. "That's what matters." David blinked at her, unsure of what to say. He gestured to the couch. "Please sit down. Can I get you some water or tea?" Eleanor shook her head, her thin fingers still gripping the paper bag. She sat gingerly on the edge of the couch, as though afraid to make herself too comfortable. David sat across from her in his worn armchair, leaning forward slightly. For a long moment, the two sat in silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. "I went to the school today," she said abruptly. David's brow furrowed. "The school?" She nodded, her hands fiddling with the strap of the bag. "I heard from Linda. She said you were going to speak to the students. So, I went. I sat in the back. You didn't see me, but I was there." David stared at her, stunned. He had not expected this. "Why?" Eleanor let out a soft, shaky breath. "I don't know," she admitted. I think I wanted to see for myself what it was you had to say. I wanted to understand why you keep trying to reach people like me." David tilted his head slightly. "And?" Eleanor looked down at the bag in her lap, her voice trembling as she continued. "You talked about kindness, about how it takes courage to meet anger with understanding. I sat there listening to you and—" She paused, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I realized something. I've been holding on to anger for a long time, anger I didn't even know I had, and it has made me bitter." David stayed silent, letting her speak. "I thought I knew everything about the world," Eleanor said softly. "I thought I had the right to say what I said to you that day in the store. But hearing you talk about your family, about what they've been through, and the sacrifices they made—" Her voice caught, and for a moment, she just sat there, staring down at the floor. "It made me ashamed, David." David leaned back slightly, his expression softening. He could see how hard this was for her, how every word felt like pulling a splinter from her skin. Finally, she looked up at him, her blue eyes shining faintly with tears she refused to shed. "I wanted to say I'm sorry." The room seemed to still with the weight of her words. David stared at her, his chest tight as he processed what she had just said. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "thank you." Eleanor let out a breath, as though she had been holding it in for years. She set the paper bag on the coffee table and pushed it toward him. "Here. It's nothing much, but it's something." David hesitated before opening the bag. Inside was a loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm. It was simple, but something about it felt heavy with meaning. "I baked it myself," Eleanor said quickly, almost defensively. "It's not perfect, but I wanted to bring you something." David smiled faintly, his voice soft. "It's perfect. Thank you." Eleanor nodded, clearly unsure of what to do next. She glanced around the room again before speaking. "You were right, you know. Change doesn't happen overnight, but maybe it can happen. Eventually, if you're willing to try." David met her gaze, feeling a lump form in his throat. I think it can. The two sat quietly for a moment, the silence now filled with understanding rather than tension. Eleanor seemed smaller somehow, but not in a weak way, more like someone who had let go of a burden she had been carrying for too long. I'll be back at the community center next week, she said finally, standing up. I figure if I'm going to start changing, I might as well do it around people who can help me understand better. David stood too, smiling faintly. We'll be glad to have you. Eleanor nodded and moved toward the door. She hesitated with her hand on the knob, looking back at him. You're a good man, David. I wish I'd seen that sooner. David's smile deepened. Sometimes it takes time to see what's right in front of us. Eleanor nodded again, then stepped out into the cool night air. David watched her leave, the door clicking softly behind her. He looked down at the loaf of bread on the table, shaking his head with quiet wonder. It was just bread, simple, warm, unremarkable, but it felt like so much more. It was a gesture, a bridge, a sign that change, no matter how slow, was possible. The next morning, as David sat at his kitchen table eating a slice of Eleanor's bread, he thought of how far they had come from a grocery store confrontation to this moment of fragile understanding. It was not perfect, but it was progress. His phone buzzed with a message from Linda. Just heard from Eleanor. She told me she's coming back to the meeting next week. She said, it's time to keep learning. David smiled as he set his phone down. For the first time in a long time, he felt like something was shifting not just in Eleanor, but in himself and in the small community around them. It was a quiet change, like a ripple spreading across still water. David took another bite of the bread, looking out the window at the sunlight breaking through the clouds. Change takes time, he thought, but it's worth waiting for. The air buzzed with quiet energy as David stepped into the community center the following week. The wooden floors creaked faintly under his shoes, and the hum of voices filled the room. It was a bigger crowd this time, more chairs, more people, some familiar faces, like Linda and George, and some new ones, including a group of teenagers David thought he recognized from the high school. The room itself felt different, too. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though something important was about to happen. David paused at the edge of the circle, scanning the room until he saw her. Eleanor Hughes. She was there, sitting stiffly in one of the chairs near the middle of the circle. Her cardigan was neatly buttoned, and her silver hair pinned back as usual. But there was something softer about her posture this time, like the armor she had carried for so long had begun to slip away. David gave her a small nod when their eyes met. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then nodded back. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it spoke volumes. Linda was already moving through the room, arranging chairs and greeting people as they arrived. When she saw David, she smiled warmly and waved him over. David, she said softly, as though she had been waiting for him. Glad you're here. Me too, David replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced at the growing crowd. Looks like word is spreading. Linda nodded, glancing around the room with pride. It is. People are realizing this group is more than just talk. It's about connection, about listening. David smiled faintly, taking a seat. He watched as people settled into the circle, chatting quietly with their neighbors. For so long, David had believed his voice was small, that the things he said did not matter. But moments like this, the growing crowd, the hopeful faces, made him think otherwise. Linda clapped her hands gently, drawing the room to attention. Welcome, everyone, she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who believed in what she was saying. It's wonderful to see so many new faces here tonight. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a place for sharing, for listening, and for growing together as a community. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. We've all seen how words can divide us, how misunderstandings can build walls that feel too big to climb. But we're here to tear those walls down brick by brick, story by story. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Linda smiled, then gestured toward the circle. Would anyone like to begin tonight? This is your space to share. For a moment, no one spoke. David was used to this by now, the silence at the start of every meeting. It was not the kind of silence that came from disinterest. It was the kind that came from hesitation, from wondering if your words would matter. Then, to David's surprise, Eleanor shifted in her seat. Her fingers tugged at the hem of her cardigan as she cleared her throat softly. "I'll go," she said. The room stilled, all eyes turning toward her. David watched as Eleanor straightened her posture, her pale blue eyes scanning the faces around her. She looked nervous, but determined, as though she had decided this was a step she needed to take. "I don't know if I have the right words," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I think it's time I try." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "For most of my life, I believed certain things because that's what I was taught. My father, he worked hard, and he raised me to believe the world was a certain way. I never questioned it. I never wanted to." David listened intently, his heart steady as her words filled the room. "But over the last couple of weeks," Eleanor continued, "I've realized that not questioning something doesn't make it right. It just means you're afraid to see the truth." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "I said something terrible to someone a couple of weeks ago. Someone who didn't deserve it. And for that, I'm ashamed." The room stayed quiet, every person listening as though Eleanor's words were fragile enough to break. She glanced toward David, her eyes softening. "But this young man here," she said, her voice carrying more strength now. "He didn't meet my anger with anger. He met it with kindness, with grace. And that made me think about everything I've been holding on to for so long." David felt his chest tighten as Eleanor spoke. She looked back at the circle, her gaze steady now. "I'm here because I want to understand better. I want to change. It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, but I figure it's better to try now than to keep living like I have been." When Eleanor finished speaking, the room stayed still for a long moment, as though no one wanted to break the spell her words had created. Then, quietly, Linda began to clap. It was not loud or enthusiastic. It was gentle and full of meaning. One by one, others joined in, the sound building like a soft wave of encouragement. Eleanor looked down at her hands, clearly moved, but unsure of how to respond. David watched her, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. It was not about winning or proving her wrong. It was about this moment, about seeing her take that first step. The rest of the meeting flowed like a stream, one person's story leading naturally into the next. A young black mother spoke about the challenges of raising her children in a world where they were judged before being known. An older Latino man talked about the prejudice he had faced when he first moved to town decades ago. Even the teenagers in the back shared their thoughts, one of them admitting he had never seen adults talk about these things so openly. David stayed quiet, listening to each person, absorbing their words like a sponge. He realized something as the night went on. Every story, every voice mattered. No one's experience was the same, but each one carried a piece of truth that could help someone else understand. When the meeting ended, people lingered, chatting quietly and sharing words of encouragement. David watched as Eleanor stood, her back straighter than before. She looked lighter, like someone who had finally set down a burden they had carried for too long. As she walked past him, she paused, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, David." David smiled faintly. "It's not me you need to thank, Eleanor. You did this." She shook her head slightly. "No, I wouldn't have done it without you." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady and sure. Outside, the air was cool, and the stars had begun to blink into the darkening sky. David stood by his car for a moment, breathing it all in, the hum of voices still drifting from the community center, the soft rustling of the trees, the sense that something real had happened tonight. He glanced toward the door and saw Linda standing there, watching the crowd disperse with a smile on her face. She walked over to him, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "You should be proud of yourself," she said quietly. "You've started something here, David. Something good." David shook his head lightly, though a small smile tugged at his lips. "It's not just me. It's all of us." Linda nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Maybe, but every ripple starts with a single stone." David looked back at the community center, the light glowing softly through the windows. For the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of peace, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Change was slow, and it was hard, but tonight, he had seen what was possible when people chose to listen instead of judge, when they chose kindness instead of anger. As he climbed into his car, he thought about his parents, about his grandfather, and about every struggle they had endured to get him here. He could almost hear his father's voice. "Plant the seed, David. The rest will come." David smiled faintly as he started the engine and pulled away from the curb, the glow of the community center fading in his rearview mirror. The seed had been planted, and now it was growing. The following Saturday, David found himself back at the garage, the rhythmic clinking of tools filling the quiet space as he worked on an old generator a farmer had brought in. It was a cold morning, the kind where the air stung against your skin, but the heat from the garage and the focus on the task at hand kept David warm. He liked the simplicity of the work. Machines were honest. You took them apart, fixed what was broken, and put them back together. If only people were as easy to repair, he thought with a faint smile. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. Wiping his hands on a rag, he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Linda. "Community center event today noon. It's a day of unity. Come by if you can. I think you'll be glad you did." David stared at the message for a moment, then looked at the generator on the workbench. It was nearly fixed. He could finish the job and call it a day, or he could go. He thought back to the past few weeks, the grocery store, the community center meetings, the dinner with Eleanor, the way things had slowly shifted, as though the pieces of a puzzle he had not known existed were finally starting to fit together. With a deep breath, David picked up his jacket and headed for the door. The community center parking lot was full when David arrived. Cars lined the street, and families walked toward the building, bundled against the chill. There was a faint hum of life in the air, children laughing, people talking softly, and the distant sound of music coming from inside. David stepped through the entrance and paused. The large hall had been transformed. Long tables were set up along the walls, filled with homemade food breads, casseroles, pies, and platters of fruit. Bright posters decorated the space, hand-drawn by children with words like "Together," "Kindness," and "We belong." At the front of the room, a small stage had been set up, where an older man with a guitar was playing a gentle tune. David smiled faintly as he took it all in. It felt different, alive. Linda spotted him from across the room and made her way over, a broad smile on her face. "David, I'm so glad you came." "Looks like you pulled this off," David replied, nodding toward the crowd. Linda chuckled. "It wasn't just me. Everyone chipped in, brought food, set up tables, decorated. It's amazing what happens when people come together." David looked around again, seeing groups of people mingling, old, young, families, individuals. People who might not have spoken to one another a month ago now sat together, eating and laughing, as though they had always been friends. "Come on," Linda said, gesturing for him to follow her. "There's someone I want you to see." David followed her through the crowd, stopping suddenly when he saw who Linda was leading him to. It was Eleanor. She stood near a table filled with plates of sandwiches, a pair of tongs in her hand as she carefully refilled a tray. She wore her usual cardigan, but something about her looked different, lighter, brighter. David watched for a moment before Eleanor noticed him. She froze briefly, her pale blue eyes meeting his, and then she nodded a small, almost shy gesture. "You came," she said quietly, setting the tongs down. "So did you," David replied, a smile tugging at his lips. Eleanor glanced around the room, her expression softening. "Linda told me I could help with the food. I figured it was time I did something useful." David nodded, his voice warm. "It's good to see you here." Eleanor looked at him for a moment, as though searching for something. Finally, she said, "It's because of you, you know. You didn't give up on me." David shook his head. "You didn't give up on yourself." Eleanor let out a quiet breath, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I didn't think I could change," she admitted. "But it's funny. The more I listened, the more I realized how much I didn't know, how much I'd been wrong about." David smiled faintly. "We're all learning, Eleanor. That's the point." She looked at him again, her gaze steady. "You were right about something else, too. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen if we're willing to let it." David felt his chest tighten with emotion, but he pushed it down, offering her a nod. "Yeah, it can." Eleanor glanced toward the table, where a young boy with dark curls stood staring hungrily at the sandwiches. She picked up the tongs again and handed him a plate. "Go ahead now. Take as much as you want," she said, her voice kind. The boy grinned and mumbled a soft, "Thank you," before running back to his family. David watched her, the small, quiet act filling him with hope. As the afternoon went on, David moved through the crowd, stopping to talk to people he had met at the meetings, and others he was meeting for the first time. Samantha, the teacher, introduced him to a group of her students, who thanked him for speaking to them the previous week. George, the older veteran, clapped him on the back and shared stories about his own family. At one point, David found himself sitting at a table with Linda and Eleanor. The three of them watched as people moved around the room, talking, laughing, and sharing food. It felt like something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the community itself. "I never thought I'd see this," Eleanor said softly, almost to herself. Linda smiled. "It's just the beginning." Eleanor looked at David then, her eyes clear and bright. "Thank you for helping me see it." David shook his head. "You helped yourself, Eleanor. I just held up a mirror." She smiled faintly, as though she were still trying to make sense of it all. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, people started to gather their things and say their goodbyes. David stood by the door, shaking hands and sharing quiet words of encouragement with those who passed. A man he had never met before stopped to thank him. "I heard about what happened at the grocery store," the man said. "What you did, what you said, it mattered. It's made people think." David nodded, humbled by the words. "Thank you. I'm just glad it's making a difference." As the crowd thinned, David spotted Eleanor walking toward the exit. She paused, looking back at the room as though she were seeing it for the first time. She turned to David and smiled a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "I'll see you at the next meeting," she said. David smiled back. "I'll be there." That evening, David sat on the small balcony outside his apartment, a blanket draped over his shoulders, as he watched the stars blink to life in the clear night sky. The hum of the town felt quieter now, like the world itself was taking a breath. He thought about everything that had led him here, the sharp words in the grocery store, the moments of doubt, the unexpected kindness that had followed. It had not been easy. Change never was, but it was worth it. David pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his father. "You were right, Dad. Sometimes all you can do is plant the seed, but it grows." He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the endless sky. Somewhere, out there, were people like Eleanor, people who were trying, one step at a time. And somewhere out there were others, like himself, willing to reach out and help them along the way. Change did not happen overnight, but it was happening. Slowly, surely, it was happening. And that was enough. As the night deepened and the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds, David sat quietly, his thoughts drifting back over everything that had happened. From that tense moment in the grocery store to the warmth of the community coming together, it all felt like a story he had been waiting his whole life to tell, a story of change, of understanding, and of kindness. He smiled faintly, his mother's words echoing softly in his mind. The world can be unfair, but it's what you make of it. David had learned that small acts of courage, moments of grace, could spark something much bigger. It was not about fixing everything overnight, but about planting seeds of hope and letting them grow. If Eleanor Hughes could change, anyone could. If a small community could come together and listen, maybe the world could too. If this message of hope, courage, and kindness resonated with you, remember that it starts with us, with the words we choose, the actions we take, and the way we treat each other every day. Change does not always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a conversation. Sometimes it begins with you. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Together, we can keep spreading stories of resilience, understanding, and hope, one ripple at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, your words matter, your actions matter, and kindness, no matter how small, can change the world.